The regional airport was packed. A routine flight turned claustrophobic. A man in a battered leather jacket and heavy boots boarded last, his rough beard drawing uneasy glances. "Hope he's not near me," a woman whispered. The flight attendant frowned at the scuffed helmet clipped to his bag. He sat at 22A, a silent shadow among suits. Suddenly, a violent shudder rocked the cabin. Warning lights strobed red as the plane entered a terminal dive. The intercom crackled with a voice stripped of professional calm. The captain's plea chilled every heart. "Is there a combat pilot on board?" Marcus Kane was 45 years old, a man whose presence was defined by the silence he kept. To the world, he was just a mechanic who spent his days covered in oil and his weekends riding a vintage motorcycle across the desolate highways of the Midwest. He was a single father, raising his 11-year-old son, Leo, in a small house filled with books and mechanical parts. Leo was his heart. The only reason Marcus kept moving after his wife, Sarah, was lost during a high-stakes medical evacuation mission in a conflict zone years ago. Sarah had been a flight nurse, a hero who died saving others, and her loss had turned Marcus into a ghost. He lived a quiet, isolated life, avoiding the spotlight and the memories of his former self. The leather jacket he wore wasn't for fashion. It was armor. It covered the old scars on his shoulders and back, physical reminders of a life he had left behind in the smoke of a cockpit. His hands were thick and calloused, but the scars on his knuckles weren't from slipping wrenches in a garage. They were the marks of a man who had operated complex machinery under the most brutal conditions imaginable. This flight was meant to be a simple journey to attend a memorial service for his wife, a trip he dreaded because it forced him to face the very sky that had taken her. He hated flying as a passenger. He hated the lack of control. But for Leo, he had boarded the plane, choosing the cheapest seat in the back to avoid being noticed. From the moment he stepped onto the aircraft, Marcus felt the weight of judgment. The business-class passengers looked at his boots with disdain. A group of younger travelers in the middle rows laughed quietly when they saw him struggling to fit his helmet into the overhead bin. He ignored them all. He had learned long ago that people see only the surface, and his surface was designed to be unapproachable. He sat in 22A, closed his eyes, and tried to focus on his breathing. He didn't pray when the clouds turned black and the wind began to howl against the fuselage. He didn't grip the armrests in fear when the first wave of turbulence hit. Instead, he tilted his head, listening to the vibration of the floorboards beneath his feet. As the plane climbed through 10,000 feet, the vibration changed. It wasn't the chaotic shaking of wind. It was a rhythmic, mechanical shudder that originated deep within the tail section. Most passengers didn't notice it yet, distracted by their phones or books, but Marcus felt it in his teeth. He knew that sound. He had heard it over the mountains of Afghanistan when a hydraulic line took a hit from small arms fire. He opened his eyes and looked at the overhead monitors. The cabin air pressure was stable, but the engine temperature indicators on the seatback screens showed a microscopic fluctuation. It was a deviation so small that the flight crew might not even see it on their primary displays for another few minutes. Marcus remained still, but his mind began to race. He started calculating airspeeds, descent rates, and the structural integrity of the composite wings. He wasn't just a biker anymore. The mechanic was receding, and the commander was emerging. He watched the flight attendants. He saw the way their professional smiles began to falter as they looked toward the cockpit door. They were trained to stay calm, but they couldn't hide the twitch in their eyes. The man sitting next to Marcus, a nervous executive, finally noticed the shaking. "Hey, is this normal?" he asked, his voice high-pitched. Marcus didn't answer with words. He simply looked at the man and gave a short, sharp nod of his head. He knew this wasn't weather. It was a cascading system failure, and it was moving faster than the pilots realized. He could feel the airframe groaning under the strain of an imbalanced load, a ghost in the machine that was about to manifest as a catastrophe. The vibration intensified, moving from a shudder to a bone-rattling groan. The aircraft groaned as if the very metal was being twisted by giant, invisible hands. A sharp, metallic ping echoed from the left side of the fuselage, a sound that cut through the roar of the engines like a gunshot. Marcus snapped his eyes toward the window, but all he could see was the gray abyss of the storm. He knew that sound. It was a mounting bracket snapping in the secondary control assembly. The plane began to yaw, the nose hunting for a center it couldn't find. The autopilot was fighting a losing battle against a mechanical reality it wasn't programmed to understand. Panic began to ripple through the cabin like an electric current. A woman 3 rows ahead screamed as the plane suddenly dropped several hundred feet, causing oxygen masks to dangle from the ceiling like yellow ghosts. The flight attendants were pinned in their seats by the G-forces, their voices barely audible over the screaming of the wind. Marcus watched the pressure gauges on the cabin wall. He saw the needle flicker. The warning lights were now a blinding red, strobing against the panic-stricken faces of the passengers. In the cockpit, the pilots were likely wrestling with a heavy yoke and a flight computer that was feeding them contradictory data. The smell of burning insulation began to permeate the air, a scent that Marcus recognized instantly as electrical death. Marcus felt the gravity of the situation pulling at his gut. He knew that if the horizontal stabilizer locked up, the plane would enter a terminal dive that no amount of pilot skill could pull out of. He unbuckled his seatbelt, the click of the metal buckle sounding unnaturally loud in the chaos. The executive next to him grabbed his arm, his face pale as death. "What are you doing? Sit down! We're going to die!" Marcus gently but firmly pried the man's hand away. He stood up, bracing his boots against the tilting floor. A flight attendant yelled from her jump seat, her face a mask of terror. "Sir, sit down immediately. We are in an emergency." Marcus ignored her, his eyes fixed on the front of the plane. He wasn't being defiant, he was being clinical. He noticed a small trail of smoke beginning to drift from the air conditioning vents. That meant a fire in the electrical bay, likely caused by the hydraulic fluid spray hitting the wiring. If that fire reached the main bus, they would lose all flight controls within seconds. He took a step forward, his leather jacket creaking. He had a choice: stay in his seat and wait for the end, or reveal the secret he had kept for a decade. He thought of Leo. He thought of the promise he made to his son that he would always come home. He thought of the memorial he was supposed to attend, and the woman who had died doing exactly what he was about to do. He could see the structural rivets vibrating in their sockets, a sign that the airframe was reaching its harmonic limit. The captain's voice finally came over the speakers. It wasn't the calm, reassuring tone of a commercial pilot. It was the voice of a man who was looking at a death sentence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a significant flight control malfunction. Is there a combat pilot on board? I repeat, is there a combat pilot on board?" The request was specific. A commercial pilot wouldn't be enough for this. They needed someone who knew how to fly a broken machine by the seat of their pants, someone who had experience with manual override systems and high-stress combat maneuvers. The cabin went silent for a heartbeat, the only sound the screaming of the engines and the wind. Everyone looked around, desperate for a savior in a uniform. Marcus stood in the center of the aisle, his tall frame nearly touching the ceiling. He looked like anything but a pilot. The leather of his jacket was scuffed, his jeans were worn, and his biker boots were caked with the dust of the road. A few passengers who had mocked him earlier stared up at him with wide, confused eyes. A man in the back whispered, "No way, not that guy." Marcus didn't look at them. He didn't seek their approval. He raised his hand, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the ambient noise of the crashing plane. "Yes," he said, "I'm here." The cabin fell into a stunned silence. The flight attendant, who had been screaming at him to sit down, froze. She looked at his rugged appearance, his rough beard, and the motorcycle helmet still clipped to his bag. She looked for a pilot's wings, a uniform, anything that signaled authority. All she saw was a biker. But then she looked into his eyes. She saw a cold, unwavering focus that she had never seen in her life. It was the look of a predator who had found its prey. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, laminated card, his old military ID. It was faded, the edges frayed, but the words were still clear. Combat Pilot, Special Operations, Classified. The flight attendant's hand shook as she took the card. She didn't even need to verify it. The transformation in Marcus was enough. He was no longer the man in 22A. He was Commander Kane. She immediately unbuckled her harness and gestured toward the front of the plane. "This way, sir. Please, hurry." Marcus moved through the cabin with a grace that contradicted his size. As he passed the rows of terrified passengers, the whispers changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by a desperate, clinging hope. The young woman who had hoped he wouldn't sit near her now reached out a hand, her fingers grazing his leather sleeve as if seeking a blessing. Marcus didn't stop. He walked to the cockpit door. The biker, who was about to save their lives. The cockpit door hissed open, and Marcus was hit by a wave of heat and the smell of ozone. The cockpit was a chaos of flashing lights and warning sirens. The co-pilot was slumped in his seat, his forehead bleeding from a strike against the panel. The captain was white-knuckling the yoke, his muscles twitching as he fought the aerodynamic forces trying to tear the plane apart. He looked back, his eyes wide with shock when he saw Marcus. "You're the pilot? Where's your uniform?" Marcus didn't waste a second on pleasantries. He stepped behind the captain's seat, his hands already hovering over the secondary control banks. "The uniform doesn't fly the plane, Captain. The man does. Tell me your status." The captain stuttered for a second before finding his voice. "Total loss of pitch control on the left elevator. The flight computer is locked in a feedback loop. We're losing altitude at 4,000 feet per minute." Marcus leaned over, his eyes scanning the hundreds of switches and dials with a speed that spoke of thousands of hours in a cockpit. He didn't look at the main screens. He looked at the manual cable tension gauges hidden at the base of the pedestal. "You don't have a computer problem, Captain. You have a physical obstruction. The secondary cable has jumped the pulley and is jamming the actuator. The fly-by-wire system is fighting a mechanical jam it can't overcome." Marcus didn't take the seat. He stood behind the captain, his voice calm, steady, and utterly authoritative. He sounded like a man who had seen the world burn and wasn't impressed. "I need you to kill the main flight bus, now!" The captain gasped. "If I do that, we lose the autopilot and the stabilization systems." Marcus leaned in, his face inches from the captain's. "The autopilot is trying to kill us because it thinks the plane is straight. We need to fly this manually. Trust me. I've landed a carrier-based jet with one wing missing. I can get this bird on the ground. We're going to use the trim wheels and engine bias to maintain attitude." The captain, seeing the iron resolve in Marcus's eyes, flipped the master bus switch. The cockpit went dark for a split second before the emergency lights kicked in. The silence was terrifying, but the vibration stopped. Marcus began barking orders, his mind working faster than any silicon chip. He began manipulating the engine thrust levers with surgical precision, feeling for the sweet spot where the asymmetric lift would stabilize. He ignored the screaming master caution alarm, focusing solely on the tactile feedback of the airframe. He was reading the wind through the skin of the aircraft, calculating the lift-to-drag ratio in his head. Every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring, ready to react to a sudden stall or a structural snap. He instructed the captain on how to use the engine thrust to compensate for the lost elevator control, a technique known as differential throttling. It was a maneuver taught only to the most elite combat pilots. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus acted as the brain of the aircraft, his hands moving over the captain's shoulders, guiding every micro-adjustment. He was a conductor leading a broken orchestra through a masterpiece of survival. He watched the airspeed indicator like a hawk, knowing that even a 5-knot deviation could trigger a stall from which there was no recovery. "Hold the line," he whispered, his voice a low growl of pure determination. Slowly, miraculously, the plane leveled off. The terrifying dive was over. Marcus watched the altimeter stabilize. They were at 6,000 feet, flying through the heart of the storm, but they were flying. He looked at the captain. "We have 90 seconds of structural integrity left on that wing route before the vibration returns. We need to put this down on the nearest highway or strip. Now, forget the landing gear. We're going in hot and flat." The captain nodded, his respect for the man in the leather jacket now absolute. Marcus had saved the flight, not with a miracle, but with the cold, hard application of skill that everyone else in the hangar had forgotten. The cabin remained in a state of breathless silence, the passengers unaware of the technical war being fought just feet away. But they felt the plane change. They felt the hand of a master on the controls. The landing was anything but smooth. They touched down on a secondary runway at a small municipal airport, the tires screaming as they fought for grip on the rain-slicked tarmac. The plane swerved, the engines roaring in reverse thrust, until finally it came to a shuddering halt just yards from the end of the runway. For a long moment there was no sound but the rain hitting the fuselage and the ticking of the cooling metal. Then, a roar of relief and applause erupted from the cabin. People were sobbing, hugging each other, and shouting in joy. They had survived a certain death, and they knew exactly who to thank. The smell of scorched rubber and hydraulic fluid filled the air, a violent reminder of how close they had come to the edge. Marcus didn't stay to hear the cheers. As the emergency slides began to deploy and the fire trucks arrived with their sirens wailing, he stepped back from the cockpit. He looked at the captain, who was trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and awe. "Nice work, Captain," Marcus said simply. The captain stood up, reaching out a hand. "Sir, I don't even know your name. The airline, the news. They're going to want to talk to you. You're a hero." Marcus looked at the hand, then back at the captain. He didn't take it. "I'm just a guy who wanted to get home, keep my name out of the reports, tell them the equipment recovered, tell them whatever you want. I have a memorial to get to. My duty here is done." Marcus walked out of the cockpit, his leather jacket zipped up tight. As he moved through the cabin toward the exit, passengers stood up, reaching out to touch him. They wanted to thank him, to know who he was, to capture the moment on their phones. Marcus kept his head down, his face a mask of indifference. He didn't want the fame. He didn't want the medals. He had spent his life in the shadows, and he wasn't about to step into the light now. One man, the executive who had been sitting next to him, blocked the aisle. "Please," the man said, his eyes wet with tears. "Let me do something for you, anything." Marcus looked him in the eye. "Just be a good person," he said. "And sit in your seat next time. Life is too short for anything else." He slipped out of the plane before the local news crews could arrive. He walked across the tarmac in the pouring rain, his motorcycle helmet tucked under his arm. He didn't wait for the airline to arrange a hotel or a limo. He walked to the airport fence, found a gap, and disappeared into the night. He was a ghost again. The flight attendants tried to find him. The airline searched the manifest for his details, but Marcus had used an old military travel voucher that was linked to a redacted file. By the time the sun came up, the biker hero was the biggest story in the country, but the man himself was already hundreds of miles away, riding his motorcycle toward a quiet grave. He didn't do any interviews. He didn't post on social media. He didn't even tell his son the full truth of what had happened. He arrived at the memorial service for his wife just as it was beginning. He stood in the back, the rain still dripping from his leather jacket. He looked at the photo of Sarah, her smile bright and eternal. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had honored her memory by doing what she had done, putting himself in the line of fire for strangers. He had proven to himself that the pilot wasn't dead. He was just waiting for a reason to fly. He realized that the sky wasn't his enemy, but a mirror of his own restless soul. Marcus returned home in the early hours of the following Tuesday. The small house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock in the hallway. He walked into the living room and saw Leo asleep on the sofa, a book about aeronautics draped across his chest. Marcus stood there for a long time, just watching his son breathe. He felt the weight of the last few days finally begin to lift. He draped a warm blanket over the boy, tucked the book away, and sat in his old armchair. Leo stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Dad, you're back? Did you fly again?" he asked sleepily. Marcus smiled, a genuine soft expression that reached his eyes. "Just a little, Leo. Just enough to get home? Let's get some sleep." In the weeks that followed, the story of the biker pilot became a legend in the aviation industry. The airline, unable to find Marcus, launched a massive internal investigation into the flight control failure. They discovered the mechanical flaw Marcus had pointed out, a defect that was present in hundreds of other aircraft. Because of his actions, a global safety directive was issued, and the flaw was fixed across the entire fleet. Thousands of lives were saved, not just on that one flight, but on countless flights in the future. The captain of the flight was promoted, but in every interview he insisted on telling the story of the man in the leather jacket. "He wasn't just a pilot," the captain told a national news program. "He was the soul of the machine. He saw what we couldn't." Internal memos circulated through the airline's headquarters. They called him the Phantom Aviator. They updated their training manuals, adding a new section on manual thrust compensation, a maneuver now unofficially named the Cane Correction. New safety protocols were mandated, requiring pilots to undergo analog training to ensure they could fly if the computers failed. The culture of the airline changed. They stopped relying solely on data and started encouraging their crews to listen to their aircraft. All of this because a man in a biker jacket decided to stand up when everyone else was sitting down. He had changed the industry without ever uttering a word in public. Marcus went back to his garage. The work was steady, the grease was familiar, and the silence was his own. But something had changed in the town. People stopped looking at his leather jacket with suspicion. They didn't know for sure if he was the man from the news, but they felt the aura of authority he now carried. When he walked into the local diner, the talking would stop for a heartbeat, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, instinctive respect. The younger mechanics in his shop stopped complaining about the old-school ways Marcus taught them. They began to realize that the man who could fix a vintage Harley could also handle a jet at 30,000 feet. His garage became a sanctuary for those who valued the truth of iron over the promise of software. One evening, as Marcus was closing up the shop, a sleek car pulled up to the curb. A man in a high-end suit stepped out, holding a briefcase. He looked around the grease-stained garage with a mixture of confusion and awe. "Marcus Kane?" he asked. Marcus didn't look up from the engine he was cleaning. "I'm busy. If it's a transmission job, come back Monday. I don't care how much you're paying." The man smiled. "I'm not here for a repair. I'm here to deliver a letter. From someone you helped. They said you'd know what it means." He placed a small, elegant envelope on the workbench and walked away without another word. Marcus opened the envelope. Inside was a simple note on heavy stationery. It didn't have a name, but it had a logo he recognized, the symbol of the Flight Nurse Association. The note said, "You flew for her, and because you did, we can still fly for them. Thank you, Commander. The sky is safer tonight." Attached to the note was a small silver pin, a set of combat pilot wings. Marcus held the wings in his hand, the metal cool against his calloused skin. He didn't put them on. He didn't pin them to his jacket. He simply placed them in his pocket, next to the photo of Sarah he always carried. He knew that his journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, the engine of his life felt perfectly in tune. The legend of the biker who saved the sky would live on in the stories of the passengers and the logs of the pilots. But Marcus Kane was content to be the man who walked his son to school. He knew that true heroism doesn't need a spotlight or a stage. It lives in the choices we make when no one is watching, and the courage we find when the world starts to shake. There are some heroes who don't need to be recognized, because their greatest reward is the silence of a job well done. And there are some prejudices that disappear forever, just because one man had the strength to stand up and speak the truth of the metal. If this story reminded you that true strength is often hidden in the most unlikely places, then you are a part of our community. At Daddy Healing Stories, we celebrate the quiet warriors, the devoted fathers, and the unsung heroes who keep our world steady. Don't forget to subscribe and follow our journey as we tell the stories of those who lead by example. We'll see you in the next story.